A lone Navy SEAL on leave walks into a snowstorm and finds a dying police officer buried alive with a message taped to her head. The note reads, "The price of betrayal," and the killers are still watching from the dark. What he uncovers next is not just a crime, but a hidden weapons network disguised as ordinary cargo. Evil is moving, faith is tested, and one soldier and his dog may be all that stands in the way. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles God hides in the darkest places. Snow buried the upper spine of Jackson Hole beneath a soundless white weight, pressing the mountains into a hush so deep it felt as if the world itself had stopped breathing. Ryan Cooper had come into the wilderness to forget the measured rhythm of war, but silence had never meant peace to him. Silence was the space where the mind replayed everything it had survived. Each step through the drifting powder echoed with memories that did not require sound to stay alive. He walked without urgency, not because there was none in him, but because urgency was now his natural state. It had shaped his breathing, his pacing, the way his thoughts lined up like rounds in a magazine. Rex moved beside him without leash or command, not following but aligning, the way partners did after years of trusting each other with everything that could be lost in a fraction of a second. The dog had learned the shape of violence long before this mountain, long before this quiet, and silence had never fooled him either. The shift in the air came first, not a sound, not a movement, just the collapse of harmony into tension. Rex stopped, his body locked, head angled toward the trees that leaned inward like frozen witnesses. A low vibration pulsed through his chest, restrained, deliberate. Ryan felt it in his own ribs before his mind named it. The wilderness had changed its posture. Rex broke from the trail without a bark, plunging into the drifts as if pulled by something invisible. Ryan followed instantly, snow breaking around his legs, breath tightening as the terrain dropped sharply into a shallow hollow sculpted by stone and wind. He slid the last few feet and landed on his knees. The first thing he saw was the note, a scrap of paper, sogden and stiff with ice, taped across the forehead of a woman half buried in snow. The ink had bled into the fibers, but the message remained unmistakable. The price of a traitor. For a fraction of a second, his mind refused to attach meaning to words that absolute. Then his training surged back with brutal clarity. This was not exposure, this was punishment. The woman's body was pinned beneath compacted snow to the ribs. Her arms were drawn behind her back, bound so tightly that dried blood darkened the grooves where rope had cut into skin. Her face was bruised, discolored by cold, but her lashes trembled faintly as the wind lifted a veil of powder from her cheeks. She was alive, but survival was losing ground with every second. Rex leapt into the hollow without hesitation and pressed his weight along her exposed side, lowering his body between her and the cutting wind. The low whine rising from his chest was not fear, it was insistence. Ryan moved with the same instinctive economy. The tape came first. He loosened it with warmed liquid from his canteen, easing it free as her lips shuddered and air rushed into her lungs in a broken gasp. Her breath rattled, shallow, panicked, then steadied as oxygen reclaimed space inside her. "You stay with me," Ryan said calmly, more directive than comfort. His hands never stopped moving. He checked her pulse, weak but present. The bindings came next. The rope resisted as if offended to be challenged, then gave. Blood surged back into her arms in violent needles of returning life. Her eyes opened, not wide, not terrified. They focused with the clarity of someone who had already accepted fear as a companion long before this moment. "They said I wouldn't be found," she whispered, the words rasped raw by cold and damage. "They were sure of it." Ryan did not ask who they were. People who left signatures like this rarely hid behind the anonymity of uncertainty. He activated his emergency locator and transmitted coordinates through the ranger frequency without shifting his attention from her. The confirmation tone returned quickly. Rescue was coming. It would not be fast enough on its own. Her gaze drifted toward the snow where the paper had fallen. A faint tightening passed through her eyes. Not despair. Something closer to bitter affirmation. "I told them no," she said. "That's why they wrote it there." Rex adjusted his posture, pressing closer to her torso, as if he understood the conversation without needing words. His warmth was deliberate, intentional. The woman's breathing stuttered. Hypothermia was closing in with quiet patience. Ryan steadied her face between his hands. "You're not done," he said. "Not here." Her lashes fluttered. "Guns," she whispered. "Not machines, not equipment. Guns. They hide them inside what people trust." That pulled Ryan's focus tighter. "Who hides them?" Her jaw trembled. "Freight shells, layered casings. They dismantle everything down to parts so scanners see nothing wrong. The routes are protected. The transfers are clean. The violence arrives without ever being labeled as such." A cough seized her, sharp and tearing. Ryan leaned in until his forehead brushed hers, blocking the wind, anchoring her attention back to the present. "Names," he said quietly. Her eyes searched his face with sudden urgency. "Mercer," she breathed. "Grant Mercer." The name landed with weight. Even here, in a hollow of snow and blood and punishment, the name carried reach. Ryan had heard it before. Everyone in logistics corridors heard it eventually. The kind of figure that owned pathways instead of people. The kind of man who never touched what he destroyed. "They call me a traitor because I wanted to speak," she whispered, "because silence feeds them." Her eyelids began to drop. Ryan tightened his grip. "Stay." She forced them open again. "They're watching the storm," she said. "They trust it more than men." Rex lifted his head abruptly, ears cutting forward. Far beyond the tree line, faint light blinked once and vanished. Not rescue, something else, something patient. Ryan felt the cold deepen. The woman's pulse thinned beneath his fingers. He bent closer, voice low. "You live through this," he told her. "You don't get to be their message." Her lips trembled as if trying to shape a final word. No sound came. Rex growled softly, not at the storm, but at the darkness waiting beyond it. The mountains did not answer. Snow continued to fall over Jackson Hole in thick, drifting curtains as emergency vehicles carved narrow, glowing paths through the frozen forest, their lights bending against the storm like fragile blades of gold. Ryan rode in the lead rescue sled beside the driver, one hand gripping the metal rail as the machine lurched over buried rock and ice, the other never leaving the hollow behind him where Rex lay pressed against Mara's wrapped body like a living shield. Every violent jolt threatened to steal what little warmth still clung to her pulse. Ryan kept his eyes on the tree line, not for reassurance, but because instinct told him that the storm itself was no longer the only thing moving through it. He had seen this before in deserts and border towns where nature was merely camouflage for intent, and tonight the mountain carried the same wrong silence. They reached the ranger outpost just before the storm thickened into something that felt almost alive. The doors were thrown open by a pair of gloved hands before the sled had fully stopped. A man moved into view with the confident haste of someone who had outrun consequence too many times to be startled by urgency. His name was Jonah Reed, a field medic who had learned medicine where chaos was the standard language shaped years ago by a border incident where half a convoy froze before help arrived. Jonah took one look at Mara and did not waste breath on questions. He worked with silent precision, cutting through layers of ice-stiffened fabric, starting warmed fluids, guiding oxygen into lungs that had nearly surrendered the argument for living. Ryan followed every movement with an intensity that had nothing to do with trust and everything to do with refusal to look away. Rex paced once before settling again beside the cot, as if proximity itself were a duty assigned long ago. Generators rattled beneath the outpost floor, casting a low mechanical growl through the room. The air smelled of antiseptic and wet pine. Somewhere beyond the walls, the wind howled like an accusation with no target. When Mara's breathing stabilized into something that could sustain minutes instead of seconds, another man entered, carrying a weather-scarred equipment case as if it weighed more than its contents. His name was Daniel Pike, and he did not belong to the Ranger Service. Years earlier, an elementary school on a freight route had been torn open by parts that were not supposed to be in a box labeled industrial couplings. Daniel had been first to recognize that bones shatter differently around weaponized steel. Since that day, he chased the spaces where paperwork lied. He did not announce himself. He studied Mara with the quiet attention of someone who understood that survival after intention was never an accident. Ryan did not explain how he had found her. Daniel did not ask. Some facts carried their own answers. Hours passed as the storm dragged the world into deeper isolation. Mara drifted between fragile sleep and shivering wakefulness as fluids warmed her from the inside. When her eyes finally opened with sustained clarity, they settled on Ryan as if he had been anchored there long before the mountain ever folded around her. She did not ask where she was. She did not ask if she had been chased. She told them instead what she had been running from. It had begun as a discrepancy so small it could hide inside any spreadsheet. A freight manifest logged as industrial containment units carried a weight variance that defied physics rather than procedure. She had flagged it, then another, then enough to suggest pattern. When she accessed CAM footage in restricted terminals, she saw authorized crews moving sealed equipment through certified channels with unremarkable rhythm. Nothing about the shipments triggered alarms because everything about their movement had been designed not to. When she isolated the internal framework of one seized unit after a routine traffic stop months earlier, she found layered compartments, shelling a hollow core packed with disassembled rifle components, sealed against detection. She had realized then that the region was being fed weapons without ever receiving a shipment labeled as such. Daniel listened without interruption, while Ryan felt the ghost of 1,000 quiet deliveries turning into something louder inside his skull. The woman explained that once the pattern emerged, the network revealed itself quickly. Civilian routes, legal shells, protected corridors. The violence moved without declaring itself. She had attempted to push the report into official systems. That was when doors closed without being seen. Access slowed. Requests returned unanswered. A superior warned her that curiosity had a cost. The final warning came when she realized she was being followed in ways not designed to be hidden. She duplicated what evidence she could into shadow repositories and began preparing an off-interface transfer to federal servers. She never completed it. They intercepted her on a forest stretch under storm warning and made sure the mountain would do what bullets would not. She spoke the name Grant Mercer without emphasis, as if naming him gave him no additional power, because power had never required permission. The room fell still when she finished. Jonah adjusted the drip without looking up. Daniel closed his case slowly, as if he were sealing a fragile circuit. Ryan's focus drifted briefly to Rex, who had not stopped watching the door since they arrived. The dog had survived a cargo ambush years earlier where what was supposed to be medical aid turned into muzzle flash and screaming metal. Rex understood the way weapons arrived disguised as mercy. When Ryan asked where the physical evidence now rested, Mara's eyes shifted toward the northern horizon beyond the walls as if she could still see into the storm. She told them the shipments staged through transfer shells in the industrial yards north of Moore Creek, scheduled to roll across state fracture within 48 hours. Daniel interpreted that as both opportunity and deadline. Outside, wind scoured the trees with icy hands. Ryan stepped out into the cold after giving a single nod that replaced agreement with action. His communicator vibrated against his wrist moments later, with an encrypted local freight alert from an oversight contact whose voice had been broken years earlier by silent pressure. Unknown diversion logged under a Mercer freight subsidiary. North Corridor. Follow-up recommended. Nothing else. No signature. Someone else had started to notice. Ryan returned inside, the shape of decision tightening into place. Behind him, Mara closed her eyes again, this time not in collapse, but in the heavy surrender of someone who had carried knowledge long enough to be bruised by it. Rex remained at her side as if guarding a truth rather than a body. Outside, the storm thickened, but beyond its veil, the machinery that had placed a price on her forehead began to feel its first unplanned friction. Ryan stood near the outpost window, watching the snow devour the world, understanding with quiet certainty that somewhere not far beyond the ridgeline, someone had realized their mistake had not yet finished breathing, and that realization would not remain patient for long. Morning broke over Jackson Hole like a thin blade of pale light, cutting the storm residue from the sky, revealing a landscape scrubbed raw by wind and cold, where every sound now carried too far. Ryan left the outpost before the generators fully powered down, not because urgency demanded it, but because stillness now felt like a luxury he no longer trusted. Rex moved ahead of him along the frozen access road with a gait that suggested memory rather than curiosity, as if the dog already knew that the right answers rarely waited in well-lit places. Moore Creek sat 20 miles north of the ridgeline, a staging corridor disguised by silence and neglect, a place built for movement but never for attention. Ryan kept the drive unremarkable, no sudden acceleration, no defensive rhythm that could be read from afar. The industrial yard revealed itself slowly through a bend in the timber like a wound that had learned how to look old. Corrugated steel structures leaned into one another beneath layers of snow. Containers stood in ranked lines marked by faded corporate insignia that meant nothing without context. No guards were visible. That was the first wrong thing. Legitimate logistics never slept completely. Around the yard's perimeter, tire marks cut shallow troughs through the white crust, recent enough that their edges had not yet been erased by drifting powder. Rex halted at the entrance and lowered his head, scenting the ground with deliberate precision. What mattered to him was not the human traffic that had passed through here, but what it carried. He moved along the stacked containers, ignoring a dozen that meant nothing, before stopping dead at a shell branded as agricultural equipment. His posture shifted. Not agitation, recognition. Ryan opened the first crate without ceremony. Inside were machine frames and sealed hydraulic housings lined with foam. Everything looked correct. Everything weighed wrong. He removed one casing and stripped the inner shell with quiet efficiency until steel outlines emerged beneath polymer shielding. The barrel was broken into segments. The firing group detached. The weapon had been dismantled just enough to disappear to scanners trained to confirm what they expected to see. Ryan felt the certainty settle into his bones with the cold. This was not a storage yard. This was a throat. Daniel arrived an hour later with a federal technician whose name Ryan did not catch and did not need. The function was clear. Documentation followed discovery. The technician worked quickly, scanning serial fragments etched deep into metal where abrasion would not reach without purpose. He confirmed what Ryan had already accepted. The components matched production batches recovered from 3 violent incidents across 2 states. All had passed through corridors serviced by the same freight subsidiary. Mercer did not touch triggers. He moved their futures. The deeper they moved into the yard, the more the pattern revealed itself. False. Partitions. Layered linings. Every innocuous shipment carried a second architecture hidden inside. Someone had invested enormous intelligence into making violence travel as cargo. Rex kennelled his attention on one path and refused all others, nose fixed to a narrow service corridor between stacked units where human traffic had recently been heavier. Halfway down the row, Ryan found a shredded glove frozen into the ice. On its wristband was stitched a transport company crest he had seen before, not on a wall or a billboard, but in old family photographs stored with better intentions. His breath stilled slightly. The insignia belonged to Cooper Freight Solutions. The name arrived before the denial. Luke. Daniel noticed the shift immediately. Ryan did not need to be asked. The line between business exposure and personal gravity vanished without ceremony. He told Daniel that his brother owned the logistics group that serviced most of the regional agriculture contracts. Luke did not traffic weapons. Luke trafficked efficiency. To him, routes were neutral until violence chose them. Daniel did not weigh in. Federal agents dealt in structures, not absolution. The first confrontation came sooner than Ryan had anticipated. Luke arrived alone just after mid-morning, his vehicle cresting the yard slope without lights, as if avoiding not detection, but declaration. He did not carry himself like a man visiting his own facility. He looked instead like someone stepping onto ground that had begun to reject him. Ryan waited beside the open shell where the dismantled rifle lay in his hands. The cold carried everything. Their words did not need to be loud. Luke did not pretend surprise when he saw what had been revealed. Surprise had died in him a long time ago. He told Ryan that contracts had shifted. Oversight had become complicated. Some freight could not be inspected without triggering penalties that would bankrupt entire chains of operators. Ryan asked if his brother knew what moved inside those chains. Luke answered by not answering. The silence confirmed more than denial ever could. The conversation did not escalate. It collapsed. Ryan told him there was blood on the roots now. Luke answered with something that sounded like fear folded into anger. He said some doors closed from the outside. That was when Rex moved between them. The dog's posture was controlled but final. Luke took a step back without knowing why. Ryan understood then that whatever pressure held his brother in place had not yet finished tightening. Luke left with nothing resolved, but everything fractured. Daniel approached afterward and said quietly that Mercer would not tolerate delayed exposure. Once a shell was broken, silence could no longer be trusted to carry weight. The federal technician pulled more fragments from the opened crate and found a coded bearer tag lodged behind inner insulation, a low-visibility tracking identifier used not for inventory, but for accountability. The numbers resolved to a command route terminating at a secondary warehouse farther north beyond Moore Creek, beyond the last regulated oversight zone. Ryan memorized the string without writing it down. Rex lifted his head toward the forest as if he had heard something the men could not. Wind stirred the tree line in a way that felt deliberate. Daniel ordered the yard sealed and its contents tagged for later recovery, but recovery only mattered if it arrived before destruction. Ryan drove back toward the ridge as the sun cut shallow paths through the clouds like hesitant certainty. His communicator vibrated once midway through the return, a single transmission from an unknown relay. No voice, no text, only a location ping and an unencoded image file captured less than a minute earlier. It showed the Ranger outpost from an external elevation. Heat signature overlay revealed 3 human forms approaching the structure's rear access under cover of active snowfall. Inside that building was Mara. Ryan felt the familiar narrowing of time as Rex lifted his head and released a low warning that came not from fear, but from knowing what was already moving. Night fell over Jackson Hole with the heavy, deliberate weight of something returning to finish unfinished work, as wind drove fresh snow through the valleys and swallowed the narrow roads that led back to the outpost. The power flickered once shortly after dusk and did not return. Only the low growl of the generators kept the building from vanishing entirely into the storm. Ryan arrived less than 20 minutes after the location ping hit his communicator, pushing the vehicle harder than the mountain roads deserved, every instinct warning him that time had shifted into a different currency. Rex rode rigid in the back, breath steady, eyes fixed forward, not frantic, not eager, but prepared in the way only those who understood ambush through loss ever truly were. Ryan cut the engine 100 yards short of the outpost and took the last stretch on foot, moving with the wind instead of against it, letting the storm hide his approach the same way it hid the men already there. The ping image had shown 3 signatures. He counted again as he circled the rear slope through low brush and ice-crusted stone. 2 near the service door, 1 farther back covering the tree line with elevated position, clean formation, professional. Mercer had not sent scavengers. He had sent surgeons. Rex froze beside him as the nearest shadow shifted, gloved hands testing the service latch with practiced patience. Ryan waited until the wind surged, until snow thickened into a moving wall, then crossed the final distance in silence. The first man never had time to react. Ryan took him down with controlled impact, pinning his airway, pressing pressure where resistance folded inward. The body slid into the drift without sound. The second attacker turned at the wrong moment, weapon rising too late as Rex slammed into his side with the force of everything the dog had learned across years of men who thought angles could save them. The man struck the ground hard, gun skittering into the dark. A muted curse cut short as Ryan disarmed him and drove him face down into ice that stole the rest of his fight. The third shadow fired from the tree line. The shot cut air where Ryan had been a heartbeat earlier. He rolled behind the generator casing as rounds snapped through metal and snow. The gunfire was suppressed, but not silent. It was surgical sound, intent with direction. Rex withdrew on command, without a word spoken, disappearing into drifting white to flank instead of pursue. Ryan returned fire only once to establish boundary before moving low and fast, changing elevation with the slope, letting the storm bend the path of sound. He felt the moment the third man realized the engagement had shifted. Fear always came late to professionals. Rex emerged from the darkness where the forest folded deeper than sight and struck with teeth locked onto the attacker's forearm. The man screamed once before vanishing under a rush of snow as Ryan closed the distance and silenced the encounter with a final impact that left only storm and breath behind. Inside the outpost, Jonah had already moved Mara from the main room into a temporary emergency shelter carved out of insulated equipment storage after the generator stuttered the second time. He had learned years earlier that wounded bodies drew danger the way metal drew lightning. Daniel guarded the corridor with a rifle taken from an evidence locker that was no longer evidence but necessity. When Ryan entered, cold and snow tracked at his heels, the tension already told them what he had stopped. What it did not tell them was whether the attempt had been finished or merely tested. Jonah examined the two captured attackers for signs of concealed triggers and found none. They carried no identifying marks, no phones, no documents. Mercer did not document erasures. He outsourced them with the same efficiency he moved freight. Daniel began coordinating extraction protocols through satellite relay as interference thickened against all conventional channels. Mara woke during the noise, eyes flooding open with the same quiet clarity Ryan had seen beneath the snow. She knew why the storm had drawn closer to the building. She'd said nothing at first, only tracked the room with gaze that had learned how to measure walls for exits. Ryan met her eyes. "They won't reach you tonight," he said. She did not ask how he knew. She asked only, "How many?" "3," he answered. "So far." The words settled into the room with an unfinished weight. Later, after the attackers had been secured and the perimeter re-established under shifting wind, Daniel brought Ryan the fragments pulled from the man Rex had disabled. A compact relay beacon tuned to a high-altitude repeater frequency that did not belong to any civilian band. Mercer had been watching the outpost in real time. Ryan understood then that the warning at his communicator had not been chance. Someone had tipped the board before the move could be finished. He had no name for that someone yet, only the shape of possibility. Another contact arrived near midnight. This one carried no image, only a voice through layered distortion that sounded as if it had crossed too many rooms without permission. The message was brief. North warehouse is active. Secondary transfer departing before dawn. Payload confirmed. Daniel stiffened at the word payload, as if it had spoken itself aloud. Ryan did not need elaboration. Dawn was no longer the future. It was a deadline. Outside, the storm accelerated as if pressed by the same urgency. Jonah monitored Mara through the night as her core temperature rose in gradual, reluctant degrees. She drifted in and out of fractured sleep, where the same sentence returned over and over in different forms. They punish silence, and they punish speech. Ryan listened without comment from the hallway where Rex lay with chin on paws, eyes open, waiting. Near 3 a.m, the silence broke again, not with gunfire, but with engines, approaching low and slow beyond the ridge. Daniel tracked the sound through sensor nodes and shook his head once. The feeds lied without lying. Multiple moving signatures, heavy, coordinated. Not a second erasure team. Something larger, a migration. Ryan felt the mountains pull tight around him. Mercer was not content to correct mistakes anymore. He was accelerating supply, while the board still had dark squares left to play on. Ryan armed without ceremony. Rex rose beside him without command. In the fading dark before dawn, the outpost stood like a small stubborn island of light in an ocean of shifting white. Inside, a woman who had refused silence was alive, but running out of places to hide. Outside, men who trafficked in pieces of war were moving toward completion. And somewhere beyond Moore Creek, a warehouse filled with shells that were not shells waited to be opened before anyone could stop what would follow. Dawn never truly arrived over the northern ridge, only a dim thinning of the black that left the world suspended between night and morning as Ryan led the convoy through unmarked forestry roads that twisted like veins beneath buried snow. The engines stayed low, subdued not by caution alone, but by the knowledge that everything ahead was already listening. Rex rode in the rear transport beside Daniel without restraint, posture locked forward as if time itself were pulling him by the spine. Mara remained behind under Jonah's protection at the outpost, her evidence already mirrored into federal black space relays, but knowledge alone could not interrupt motion. The warehouse emerged from the fog, where the tree line broke open like a scar cut into the land, a massive steel structure disguised as cold storage infrastructure with corporate decals faded just enough to signal age without inviting inspection. Thermal feeds revealed dense internal movement, not workers, armed clusters, men positioned not around product but around inevitability. Ryan split the team without needing to speak long about it. Federal units folded wide into the perimeter. Daniel moved with 2 technical agents toward the eastern access, where electrical banks fed internal controls. Ryan and Rex took the northern blind side along pressure shadow, where wind erased footprint trails as fast as they formed. As they advanced, Rex slowed, lowering into deliberate silence, not because danger increased, but because repetition did. He had run this path before in a different place, beneath different stars, when metal waited inside crates and men mistook stillness for safety. The breach came without sirens. Daniel's charge cut power with a soundless precision that left the warehouse breathing on emergency reserves alone, crimson backup lights staining the snow through narrow windows like spilled warning. Ryan moved at the moment sound vanished, driving into the structure through a side access door Rex had already weakened with brute force and patience. Inside, the smell shifted instantly. Cold steel, packing foam, gun oil sealed into containers that wore agricultural labels like masks. The first resistance fell before it finished rising. 2 guards dropped under suppressed fire as Rex surged past them toward deeper noise where men scrambled without rhythm. Automatic weapons barked once before cutting short. The fight did not become loud. It became fast. Teams separated and reformed by doctrine learned through failure long before victory ever taught it anew. Ryan cut through partition walls and emerged into the warehouse heart where containers stood stacked 3 high and rows so long they bent perspective into tunnels of intent. Here the truth opened fully. Crates labeled seed storage housed dismantled rifles. Cold chain refrigeration units held boxed detonators stabilized against heat drift. Agricultural processing tanks concealed plate stacks and breech tools. Mercer had not trafficked violence, incidentally. He had engineered it for scalable silence. Daniel reached the main operations floor as a running firefight knotted through the central aisle. Ryan saw him drop one shooter clean and roll behind a pallet stack where return fire chipped steel into sparks. Rex lunged again and again, not reckless but exact, driving attackers into angles where they could not fire without killing one another. Somewhere behind the lines, a familiar voice cut through the echoes, not in command, but in rupture. Luke stood at a raised control platform overlooking the stacks, flanked by 2 men who held weapons not comfortably, but because they had been told to. His face carried the hollow mark of someone who had already lost the argument before it turned physical. Ryan moved beneath the platform and looked up as Luke shouted his name through the chaos like a final severed chord. The brothers locked eyes through layers of noise. Luke fired once not at Ryan but at the steel beside him as a signal he had never wanted to send. The 2 men at his side dropped under federal fire seconds later. "It was never just shipping," Luke shouted, voice breaking through the storm of sound. "It was leverage." Ryan mounted the platform in 3 steps and pressed the muzzle of his weapon to the console beside Luke's hand without touching flesh. Luke told him that Mercer had positioned armed caches along interstate exit spines under legitimate freight protection for months, while manpower filled outward through cutout crews trained not as soldiers, but as replacements. Once seated, the network no longer required leadership, only ignition. Ryan understood then why the convoy moving in the storm toward the outpost had felt heavier than a retrieval. It had been an insurance policy for something larger than erasure. Daniel's voice cracked over tactical comms that the final interior transformers had been secured, but that additional outbound units had departed less than 10 minutes before the breach. The warehouse was only the throat. The weaponization had already begun traveling. Rex suddenly stiffened. His attention snapped toward a shadowed upper corridor where movement came wrong too fast. A figure emerged carrying not a rifle, but a remote detonator rig encased in shock shell. The man did not intend to survive long enough to aim. Ryan fired, but the figure vanished behind a container stack. Explosion timers began cascading through the space as secondary units armed on delayed phase. Luke collapsed to his knees, hands over his head, shouting over the rising shriek of activated devices that Mercer had embedded for contingency failure. The warehouse had never been designed to be seized, only erased. Ryan grabbed Luke and dragged him toward the service core where reinforced firewalls could shield limited blast. Daniel sprinted through fragmentation debris, blood from a shallow arm wound streaking across his sleeve as he coded override sequences into central kill switches that did not exist because Mercer had never allowed interruption into his designs. Rex ran ahead of them through falling debris, barking not in warning now but in command, herding motion through falling danger with the authority of a creature that understood destruction before men ever named it. The first detonation ruptured the far freight row in a concussive swell that split steel like bark. The second tore open the roof support, sending snow and fire crashing inward together. Daniel reached the breaker core as the third arming signal screamed alive through the air. He slammed the final relay with both hands, and the world stuttered between motion and release. The fourth device went silent mid-whine as power collapsed into dead metal. The remaining charges lost sequence synchronization and failed to cascade. Smoke choked the chamber. Fire gutters licked along broken casings without accelerating. The warehouse did not vanish. It bled and remained. Ryan felt the aftershock settle into his chest as Rex reappeared at his side, dusted with ash, eyes still locked forward because threat had not yet finished moving. Smoke drifted through the shattered ribs of the north warehouse like a wounded spirit that had not yet accepted its ending as federal units secured the remaining heat pockets and the last of the suppressed fires hissed themselves into reluctant stillness beneath drowning foam. Ryan stood near the collapsed central aisle with Rex pressed tightly against his leg, feeling the vibration of the dog's low, steady breathing travel upward through his bones like a metronome pulling him back from the edge where everything had nearly vanished at once. Daniel moved through the debris field, speaking short-clipped instructions into his comm as medics rushed toward the wounded and armored teams, fanned outward to secure the perimeter in widening arcs. Luke remained seated against the scorched control base where Ryan had dropped him during the final surge, his hands bound not with violence, but with an emptiness that had already resigned itself to consequence. He did not look at Ryan at first. He looked at what remained of the machinery he had once sworn was just freight, and the truth of what he had protected returned to him in pieces of twisted steel and melted casings rather than arguments. The evidence teams moved with methodical inevitability through Mercer's failed erasure, collecting intact crates, backup drives, coded shipment logs, and imprint markers that mapped the weapon flow outward like infected arteries. What Daniel had feared was confirmed within minutes. The North Warehouse had been a primary ignition hub, but not the only one. 2 secondary convoys had already moved before the breach, rolling through separate corridors under civilian disguise, with enough firepower to alter entire regional balances overnight, if left unchecked. The war was no longer hypothetical. It had been set loose. The floor shuddered beneath a distant rumble as one surviving warehouse generator collapsed in final exhaustion. Ryan turned to Luke at last, their eye contact held without speech long enough for years to pass in silence between them. Luke spoke first, his voice stripped down to grain and quiet. He told Ryan that Mercer had come to him after a debt spiral tangled itself beyond repair. Contracts failed. Carriers vanished. Banks closed invisible hands. Mercer had promised salvage through protected volume. He never said weapons. He never had to. By the time Luke understood what moved inside his shipments, his signature was already tied to roots that no longer belonged to him. The men who approached him stopped asking permission years ago. Ryan listened without interruption, He had learned long ago that explanations offered under collapse were not meant for absolution. They were meant for witnessing. Luke finished by saying that when he saw the outpost transmission fail and the storm close around his brother's mountain, he believed for the first time that silence would eventually destroy what power had preserved. That was when he decided to walk into the warehouse, knowing he might not walk back out. Ryan nodded once. That meant more than forgiveness ever could. Daniel approached with a final confirmation. Mercer had been intercepted less than 10 miles south, attempting to exfiltrate under false convoy escort. He was alive. He was furious, and he was no longer insulated. Luke exhaled a breath that shook before it settled. Hours later, the sun rose reluctantly above a world that had learned exhaustion during the night. At the outpost, Mara sat upright for the first time, unassisted, wrapped in thermal blankets as Jonah monitored her vitals with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had wrestled death back into delay. When she saw Ryan enter, she studied not his expression, but the dust on his boots and the dog by his side to read the shape of what had occurred beyond the ridgeline. He told her the warehouse had been broken. He did not tell her how close it had come to breaking everything else. She nodded slowly and closed her eyes again as if bracing against the echo of what her survival had multiplied. Federal transfer vehicles arrived by midday to relocate her under protected custody. As she was loaded into the ambulance stretcher, she reached once toward Rex and pressed her hand briefly into his fur. The dog leaned forward without command and rested his head beneath her palm for the span of a single breath. She whispered that she had been afraid to die not because she wanted to live, but because she did not want what she carried to die with her. Ryan understood that the mountain had been only the second test of her courage. The first had begun long before the snow touched her face. By nightfall, the regional grid awakened with the news that Grant Mercer had been charged under layered federal statutes carrying sentences that would outlive the remainder of his ambition. The public version named smuggling, corruption, and murder conspiracies. The classified annex contained the map of dismantled routes that had not yet realized they had died. Luke was taken into custody separately. He relinquished every ledger, password, and offshore proxy he had ever been forced to sign. Ryan watched the transport disappear down the frozen road without signal or gesture exchanged between them, because nothing remained unfinished in what had already been surrendered. Days later, the ridge returned to silence in the fragile way only aftermath understands. The North Warehouse stood as a scar cut clean through industrial snowfields, cordoned beneath federal seal, and empty of its former intent. At the outpost, Ryan brewed coffee without ceremony as Rex lay by the threshold watching the forest rewrite itself with drifting branches and falling light. Daniel departed shortly after, with the same quiet arrival he had carried with him, leaving behind only a tightening network of agents who would ensure what had been unearthed would not be buried again. Jonah remained long enough to witness Mara's safe extraction before melting back into whichever line required him next. When the last engines vanished beyond the tree line, Ryan was alone again with the mountain and the dog that had followed him into every threshold that mattered. That night he sat on the porch beneath a clearing sky where frozen stars cut sharp holes through darkness, and listened to Rex breathe in steady, vigilant rhythm at his feet. The world had not healed. It had simply paused in the place where damage had been prevented from becoming destiny. Somewhere far beyond the ridge, men would still chase weapons through quieter paths, and silence would still be sold under different labels. But here, on this edge of snow and conscience, one line had been held not by power or law, but by a refusal to look away and a creature that never thought retreat meant survival. Ryan rested his hand once on Rex's back. The dog did not move. He did not need to. Together they faced the dark, not as conquerors, but as witnesses that sometimes the price of betrayal is not paid by the innocent if someone else stands between the storm and what it tries to bury. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder or fire from the sky. Sometimes they arrive quietly through the courage of one person who refuses to look away, through the loyalty of one soul who never abandons, and through the hand of God moving where human strength has reached its limit. What happened on that frozen mountain was not just the defeat of evil, but a reminder that light still walks among us, even in places buried by fear and silence. In our everyday lives, we may never face hidden weapons or powerful enemies, but we all face moments where fear tells us to stay silent, to turn away, to protect ourselves instead of what is right. And yet, every time we choose truth over comfort, courage over silence, love over fear, a small miracle is born. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment to tell us where you're watching from and what this story meant to you. And if you believe that kindness, courage, and faith still matter in this world, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing these stories of light in dark places. May God bless you, protect your family, guide your steps through every storm, and fill your life with strength, peace, and quiet miracles every single day.